Welcome to our second keynote of the afternoon. Diane has set the bar very, very high. It was a wonderful, wonderful presentation, Diane. Thank you. Phil, I'll introduce him in a second, but before we jump into introducing Phil, Rick wanted to come up and welcome you and say a few words. President Kobeck.
Thank you. Yeah. My deliverable for this next 3 minutes is to be sure that you know the degree to which Michigan Tech supports the College of Computing and their future. We're so excited. Well, last night, though, those that were there to see the induction of Dr. Ott and a colleague, Dave House, into the College of Computing Honor Academy, did it strike you about the history that helped make where we're at standing here today? And I thought about that and the commitment that they had, the leadership that they provided, and the perseverance that they provided. It just so happens I'm right now reading again the little book about Michigan Tech from 1885 to 1895. And I looked at, I'm like, you know what? That's the history of Michigan Tech. I mean, it always seems like with techs, the wind's sometimes at our back, but a lot of times it feels like it's in our face. And so I was thinking about how this college got started. It needed perseverance, needed leadership, and just needed time. And just now I'm going to give you a little snippet about the history of tech. So when I said 1885 to 1995, actually the founding legislation, the first founding legislation of our institution was 1869. And it was in March 15th of 1869, this institution was theoretically established. And then in April, the first shots at Fort Sumter happened. And Michigan Tech disappeared off the radar again. So then, and it was leadership, a guy named Douglas, that helped drive that. So we got that initial legislation, but then it disappeared. You know why? There was no money attached to that legislation. There's no way to generate revenue. That's why we want to be sure that Dennis knows we are here to support you in all aspects to make sure you succeed. So yeah, in 1885, people didn't want another university either, right? Because we had, well, it's Michigan State now, and anything you would do like mining was actually already being done at Michigan State. We don't need that. So it took a pretty tough nut, Hubble. And again, what you'll hear is names that you can see around campus. Just like you'll see the names on your academy wall someday and you go, yep, Dr. Ott, you know, they helped you. Yep, Dave House helped change it. It was Hubble that drove that legislation through. Our public act from 1885 is Act 70. That's the one we oftentimes lean on. 1885, we're good to go. Did you know in 1890, the legislation put a committee together to close our institution? They wanted to close our institution because it was Republicans that started us, complete flip. And then at that time, it was the Democrats. And then they wanted to close us. And I just wanted to read a quote from Wadsworth, the president. After they pushed back, and it struck me because this is Michigan Tech. Let me get my glasses. This is when he fought that battle to not close us, and he talked about Michigan Tech. Now it's a little flowery for my taste, as you can know if you know me, but when the rain descended and the floods came and the winds blew and beat upon that house, and it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock in the hearts of the people of the northern peninsula. How about that? That's us. That's us. But then, so related to this college, so you had some great leaders, right, that dealt with headwinds. So related to this college, it was in 1915 that they first proposed, why don't we do more than mining? 1915. And then there was an article in the Alumnus magazine that said, why would we depart from something that's made us successful all this time? And then it stopped. And it was the Board of Trustees, Board of Control, Dave knows, it wasn't until 11 years later, it was December of 1925, 11 years later, they actually came up with that. And then in 1926, that's when we changed to the College of Mining and Technology. We had to actually change our statute that started this university so that we could actually include technology. And that was, at that time, it was biology and chemistry and general engineering. The moral of the story was that was 11 years. Tim, I was trying to count how long you had been working on all of this. You know, I don't know if it's 11 years or how long I've been trying to get this college up. Dave probably knows. You're not alone in that decade-long journey. with regard to that. I'm just going to end with this. I thought about that. Imagine when they passed the word technology and put that in our name in 1926, and they were trying to think about what that means. It's pretty interesting. We look back on that and go, wow, I wonder what they thought technology was. And then here we are today, we're thinking that we're looking back, but it won't be very long until people look back at us. We're looking ahead at this conference, but as Dave said last night, someone works 40 years, you're in 2065, they'll be looking back on us just like we're looking back on that time. And I think that they will look back on this time, the establishment of this college, the same way I just look back on the establishment of the university, and what a historic moment it was for Michigan Tech, both 1885 and 2020. So thanks for your leadership, Dennis. I'll hand it over to you.
It's very nice, Rick. Thank you very much. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Dr. Phil Bourne. When I think of computing, when I think of the College of Computing, when I hear that, what I really hear is computing and data science. They are two different disciplines. They're distinct, but they're closely related cousins. And for sure, growing data science at Michigan Tech within the College of Computing is a major priority for us. And as such, I can think of no better keynote speaker for us than Phil. We'd actually originally invited Phil to be here last fall as a ICC Distinguished Lecture Series speaker. COVID and Omicron had changed that a little bit, and actually ended up being quite very fortuitous for us, as he could be here as part of the showcase. And as I mentioned last night, one of the key things of the showcase is connections. We're trying to connect all of us who work in and with computing. We're trying to connect with our alumni, with our industry partners, and a really important narrative, and this connects to what Diane was saying, what Rick was just saying, connecting our past to our present and our future as we change and we adapt and move on. And so as we think about a future that embraces data science more boldly, where we're going, Phil's talk will be perfectly on point. And in my discipline of bioinformatics, the discipline that I've worked in bioinformatics, there is no bigger name than Phil Bourne. Phil's a real rock star. He's trained like me as a physical chemist, so we neither one of us come up from traditional computing spaces. But he's spent his entire career advancing data science, especially as it relates to the biomedical sciences. So he was associate director and led the protein data bank for many years, which was one of the biggest and most important public repositories of data in the biomedical sciences, and especially within structural biology. That's how I was sort of first introduced to Phil. He was the original, and hopefully this won't sound too crass, the data science czar at NIH. So he was the founding associate director for data sciences at NIH, where they were trying to figure out how is the NIH going to adapt and evolve and stay ahead of what's happening in all the data that's being produced, and how can we take that back into patient outcomes and improve our understanding of the biomedical spaces. One of the key outcomes of that was a program called BDK, Big Data to Knowledge, that many of you probably are familiar with now. He's the founding editor-in-chief of what I think of as the most important journal in our discipline, PLOS Computational Biology. And it's a journal that I'm proud to have interacted with a lot in the past. But one of the key things that I love about this journal, we were just talking about this, and Diane, we have some work for you as well. Phil wrote an article in that called 10 Simple Rules for Getting Published. And that 10 Simple Rules was really pragmatic and sort of distilled down some very simple ideas to help people. And that 10 Simple Rules idea has continued into now, would you say, over 1,000 simple rules. And it's a main feature of the journal. And it highlights and epitomizes Phil's willingness to give back and help make everyone better, to bring other people along, which is, again, not dissimilar from some of the things that Diane was talking about. And I asked him, Diane, if there's been a 10 simple rules for adapting to change yet. And apparently there hasn't. So we have some homework. Phil is an outstanding and highly cited researcher. His combinatorial extension algorithm, which is a heuristic for solving a very difficult problem of aligning two protein structures in three-dimensional space, is one of the industry standards and is one that I have taught in my classes many, many times. He is currently the founding Stephenson Dean of Data Science at UVA, so the oldest public university in the country. He's a professor of biomedical engineering. Prior to going to NIH and then later UVA, he was at UCSD for many years, for 20 years. UCSD over the last 20, 30 years has really skyrocketed to the very front of the biomedical space. And Phil was there for driving that whole advance of it becoming one of the most important institutions in our discipline. And so I could keep going on and on and on, but I'll eat into Phil's time. So Phil, thank you very much, and please join me in welcoming Phil Bourne.
Thank you very much, Dennis. That was very nice of you. I always say when there's an introduction like that, it's bound to be downhill from this point forward. So I'll do my best not to make it such, but we'll see. I'm actually going to really continue this theme of change, but I'm going to do it in this context of this talk as it relates to academia itself, which I feel is in very serious need of some thought-provoking and some change. So I'll give you the sense of why I feel that as I go along. I should say this code here, you can actually, if you want the slides, in keeping with the kind of things that Dennis was saying, I believe very strongly in open knowledge. So these slides you can are available from these various mechanisms to download and do whatever you want with, should you care. All right. There's nothing like being the Dean of Data Science and you can't change the slides. Oh, here we go. All right, so I'm going to give you the punchline straight away, which is essentially that in 40 years or more, I'm actually, 40 is a bit generous, it's considerably more than that now, as you could probably tell by looking at me. I've never really seen anything like what's going on in academia right now. I think it's profoundly different, beginning to be that way. And it's really the response, as we all know, and you're all involved with the digital transformation of society. And it's touching every discipline. That's the difference, I think. So we're doing projects with religious studies. We're doing projects with economics. We're doing projects in biomedicine. We're doing projects in fintech, all of them driven by, obviously, a lot of data. So I think that leads to thinking about all of this in a certain way. And so, and I'll get to that in a second, because it's really my own bias, and I'll explain it in terms of my bias. But clearly what's going on is disruptive. And I believe that higher ed, including what we're trying to do, and I tell our president this all the time, and I'm telling your president that, you know, we better pay attention to this. And I can see that you are already. So I think that's really positive. So I'm not going to go over what Dennis just said, but just the items on the left, I think I have a certain bias in all of what I'm telling you. So, I encourage you to, we all have our own biases. So we already had a discussion at our table, and I encourage you to push back. As I talk, please yell out and interrupt and disagree, or you could yell out and agree, but that's unlikely. So, you know, please feel free to speak up as we go along. But, you know, I'm driven by all of these things on the left, and I'll get to more of that in a bit, which certainly drives me to thinking about these changes. Just to say a couple of things, I spent quite a lot of time at when I was at UC San Diego. I formed several companies while I was there, and I had such a terrible time with the tech transfer office. I remember saying to our vice chancellor for research, I'm going to bring that office down. And one day she called me up and said, I want you to bring that office up. Why don't you come and work in my office as the associate vice chancellor for innovation? So that got me thinking a lot more about translation and trying to help with that at least. And then when I was at NIH, I reported directly to Francis Collins, who was until recently the director of NIH. And that was funders to some extent of a lever. But I only lasted there 3 years because I would go to Francis and I'd say, Francis, we really have to do this. And he would say, I don't think we can do that. I said, you are the director of NIH. Surely we can do this. And, it just became too frustrating for me. So I then moved to somewhere where I had more control over my environment. And we're trying to establish a school. It's only 2 years old now, but we're trying to do that in the context of taking advantage of all this change, but not for change for its change's sake, but to really look at what's happening, look at it in the context of our own institution and the kinds of jobs that our students want, the kinds of research that needs to be done to save our planet, and really try and do what's necessary in that context. So that's really where I'm coming from. But there is a precedent. Diane mentioned that she worked on the Human Genome Project. I worked on that too. I'm sure a few years before you did, but anyway, that to me was the real game changer. It was the first time that I got involved. When I got involved with the project, without going into the details, there's not going to be much. Don't worry, there's much biology in this, but it was the notion that there was a synergy between experiment and computation. This is way back many years ago. And it was driven by the fact that we were generating this digital data around the human genome, namely DNA sequence. And that struck me. I said, this is going to be the future of biomedicine. And in many ways, I think that's really what happened. And the fact is, if you look at what's happened around the genome, it's spawned, there are various estimates around $600 billion worth of industry has formed around that. So, so just more on that, I think it's gone on since the early 90s, but basically it's now really the driver, in my opinion, for healthcare of the future. So, and that's all come from digital data. So we've seen this essentially exponential change. If you translate that into what's happened in the life sciences as one field. So I'm saying all this, not because I want to emphasize the life sciences, but just to emphasize what I feel is happening in other fields as well. If you're a historian, your life is completely different going forward. There's just no two ways about it in my mind. So this is actually a presentation slide I made to the advisory board of the NIH director, which is the body that governs the National Institutes of Health. And no one actually pushed back on me seriously when I said what I'm about to show you, except the timing, I think, was a little off. I'm always very optimistic about how change is going to happen in a certain time frame. So the raw material, of course, over time has been DNA sequence, but then we went into complete genomes. It doesn't really matter if you're not a biologist what this is, but clearly, one of the things that happened, I'd say around the time of the younger George Bush, was the emphasis on the electronic health record. So which has changed things. And I'm going to say a little more about multi-scale modeling at the end. But really, this is the sort of raw material. The raw material, the amount of material you've got has changed. That's then changed the disciplines themselves. So I think what happened historically, and I think it's worth looking at this historical precedent, is that, when I started in this business as a computational biologist, there was just a handful of us and we were like complete outsiders. And then the Genome Project, as we said, changed that. And as it emerged, I think what happened is industry got onto it. And industry thought this was going to be the change that was going to change everything. The issue was the time frame. So half of all the bioinformaticians, half the people doing this kind of work, computational biology, went into industry from academia. Within 5 years, when it didn't bear the fruit that industry expected, many of them came back and into academia because the time frame wasn't quite right. At that point, a lot of this became a service. It wasn't recognized as being academically a real discipline. It was a kind of a service in the field. Then what happened as it became more and more prevalent, more and more important to the future of the life sciences and the future of healthcare, it really became a partner. And then what I said at this meeting, I've changed the slide because I said it was going to happen in 2020. It's already 2022 and it's still not really there. But it's the notion that healthcare is going to be driven by computation. not driven by experiment and so on. And I think there's just, in my mind, there's no question that that's already starting to happen. And so,
what do you mean by partner?
So I think what I mean by partner is that at the time, let's say around 2015, we were partners between academia with the experimentalists. So sorry, I wasn't clear. And I would say the proof of that is you could then, around that time, you could actually get tenure as a computational biologist, right? Which until that time, it's like, oh, you're a technician, it's interesting. This is lots of different types of change. And that's why I want to emphasize it. Thank you for, if I'm not making any sense, which my wife says happens all the time, then please, just yell out. So the question I ask myself in all of this is, given this history, if we had this change in one field, can it happen in other places? I'll give you an example from a completely different area. When I was doing this role as Associate Vice Chancellor, I actually went over to talk. I was actually in the School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences. I went over to talk to someone in the business school, in the Rady Business School. And they had a paper on their desk. I looked at it. It was one of our papers. I said, "Oh, you knew I was coming over, and you pulled out one of our papers just to be nice." I said, "No, I don't even know who you are. I actually using a statistical method in this paper. We're analyzing marketing data." I said, "You're kidding, right?" He said, "No." So we started talking about it. We then had a meet. This is around 2012, 13. We then had a meeting that we organized between us. It was called Big Data at UCSD Day. More faculty came to that meeting than any other meeting in the university's history, partly because they smelt money. Big data was the whole thing. So
Which year was that?
that was about 2012, 2013. And, things have obviously taken off since then. So if this is what's happening, let's break down an existing success story and just into its component parts and see how that translates to what we should be doing in the university. So if you're not familiar with this, that every year Science magazine publishes the breakthrough of the year. This past year, it was effectively the solution to protein structure prediction. So I'm going to tell you just 1 minute on biology, right, which I think is my most fascinating fact in biology. If you take a protein that we're obviously composed of, and there are 20 amino acids, and a typical protein is 300 amino acids, let's say. That's 20 to the 300 possibilities. That's more than all of the atoms in the universe. Right? What we know currently are of the order of, say, 10 million protein sequences. So this is that. So you can imagine a string of beads, 20 different colored beads. That's the protein. There's 10 million or so of those sequences. They fold up into the order of thousands of different shapes. And it's those shapes that infer biological function as well as disease. So it's a remarkable act of nature's reductionism. And we've been trying to understand this for a long time, many people. And the problem was solved this past year or so by this, which the group will get to in a second. But the reason this was so easy to measure is because there was a competition called the Critical Assessment of Structure Prediction that had gone on for 20 years. And every 2 years, a group of people who were doing these kinds of predictions would get together, and they would get hold of experimental sequences, the linear strings, knowing that the 3D structures have been solved experimentally but weren't yet available. They would make their predictions, and then they'd all get together and compare their results to each other. We participated in this early on. We were pretty useless, I have to say. But it created a series of benchmarks for what progress in the field over that period of time. All right, what's going on here? Sorry. I'm having a lot of trouble with this. I don't know why I can't use it. Now I can't read the slide changer thing. Ah, there we go. All right, so this is the results of that. the reason it intrigues me is part is a little personal story. So my son works in London at Industrial Light and Magic. And he was in the pub one evening, which is, I guess, like father, like son. And he texts me and says, Dad, there's a group of guys, mainly guys, I have to say, at the next table who are talking about protein prediction. And isn't that what you do? And I said, who are they? And he texts back, they're from the Google DeepMind in the London office. And these were the folks that ultimately, without Google spin-off, they actually solved this problem. This is what probably one of the biggest outstanding problems in molecular biology. And what this shows is essentially how successful they were. So over the years with these competitions, you can see over the years, and the y-axis is essentially the correctness of the structures. And you can see that there was this massive jump with this so-called AlphaFold 2 on the left-hand side here in 2020. What's so profound about it is that it's almost as good as the experimental structure. So this, as it stands right now, one of these computations can be done in literally minutes to hours, whereas an experiment to get to the same result would take months, or could take months. So this has a profound effect on biology, and it's not just the simplicity or simple structures. You can see on the right-hand side that even the most difficult cases get solved fairly easily. I won't go into a lot of the methodology here because probably most of the people in the room could explain it better than me. But what I would say is a couple of things about this. What they did was effectively, it was all about gradient descent. They put a lot of information together, and I'm going to explain to you why this I think was so successful. It's really a lesson in engineering, because ultimately there's virtually nothing new in what they did to solve this really outstanding problem. So what were the logistics behind this win? As I said, nothing fundamentally new. Basically, it was about data integration, which I think we all, anyone who's in data science know we spend about 80% of our time data wrangling. And so the integration of the data is a key part. In this case, they used a very large number of sequences in a so-called multiple sequence alignment. Interestingly, if you think about how science is set up right now, is that each of you are all going to go away today and probably write a grant, maybe. And guess what? You're all competing for the same pot of money. You're competing against people who sit in the next office to you often. What happened here is really a total collaboration. I mean, this is funded by Google, so they have a lot of resources. But it was essentially a team of the order of 30 people. We don't actually build teams like that in academia, hardly ever, except for very large projects. It was also more an engineering challenge to put all this together than it was any kind of innovative breakthrough. So that's to say that, we're in academia, generally speaking, in my point of view, and you can always push back, it's hard to do that. We're just not set up to do that on a bigger scale. We work too much at the individual level, which obviously has merits as well. So the question is, how do you blend these things together? We don't necessarily have the compute power that we need to solve some of these problems in the way that Google does, obviously. The team size, as I said, and it's also working in an interdisciplinary way. A group of machine learning experts working with protein experts. So what are the downstream implications? I think cooperation rather than competition. And we're not set up to do that very well. Finally, the NIH is coming around to this sort of thinking. And you're starting to see a lot of bigger sort of efforts that push people to cooperate more together to solve big problems. Public-private partnership. Perhaps it sounds to me from what I've heard about what goes on here, you're really pushing in that direction. But there are a lot of places where that's actually frowned upon, which seems to me absolutely crazy at this day and age. We're setting up a school of data science. we're actually having corporate partners on the campus with us as we develop our things. The translational possibilities that come out of this one breakthrough are absolutely astronomical. So effectively, they've now got, of all of those millions and millions of sequences I meant, they've generated computational structures, which are going to have downstream an enormous impact on healthcare and food production and energy production and biodegradation and so many other things. It's just amazing. It's all based on open data. So one of the things that we were talking about this at lunch is that within our School of Data Science, every faculty member signs on to making all of their research products open. That's not to say they can't opt out to when there's IP concern possibilities, or indeed that they want to publish in a non-open journal. We obviously allow that, but most of the time that's not the case. So that people sign on to this. And what's happened, and this relates to your own institution, is that it's now the institutions who are the sort of focal point of open knowledge. So what we've seen over the years is we've seen situations where, first of all, it started with the publishing movement. There was a big push towards open access of journal articles. All right, so the publishers are doing their bit as much as they're going to do. Those closed access publishers are making money and not going to change anything. On the other end of the spectrum, the NSF, the NIH, the DOE, all these agencies have been much more rigorous about creating data sharing and other kinds of policies around sharing of research products. The bit that's missing in the middle is how the institutions respond to that. And I'm part of a roundtable effort at the National Academies that has actually got now, I think, the order of 50 to 100 institutions that have all signed on to actually making their research products more open. In our own school, a policy that we made, or it's actually a set of guidelines we made for the school, was actually adopted by the Faculty Senate, and it became policy for the whole university. And we're now making that into a policy of the university, and we're sharing that with other institutions as our effort. So this round table is a way of exchanging best practices towards greater openness. And it just seems absolutely necessary for data science, because we wouldn't have data scientists if we didn't have open data and open methods and open protocols and open workflows and so on. So all of this is important. We also need to appreciate the engineering. I think obviously that's not a problem here, but you go you go to other areas, like in biomedicine, they don't appreciate people who do the engineering. I mean, it's changing slowly. But I used to run projects out of medical schools where I would speak of the Google bus. So basically, we're in San Diego. Google didn't have an office, but they had an office in Irvine, and they ran a very fancy bus with Wi-Fi and streaming Netflix, of course. And I was losing my best software folks to go and get on that Google bus because they weren't appreciated in the university environment. And I don't think necessarily happens certainly in engineering schools, but it happens in part in other areas of the university. At least that's my sense of it. So given these precedents, how should we think about data science in this academic context, if you're buying into the things I'm saying? So first of all, I think the way we thought about this is just one interpretation, is if I asked each one of you what the internet was, you'd tell me 40 different things. Same with data science, and yet you use it every day. So what we've decided we needed to do is we needed to rally behind some definition and set of principles of data science that we could all get onto, so we could all essentially be part of the same cultural package, at least in principle. That was the idea. So the right culture starts with all being on the same page as how we define data science. So we spent a lot of time sitting around figuring out what that meant for us. And we came up with this particular model. The current strategic plan we have for the School of Data Science is to, in the next 2 to 5 years, is really to evaluate how well that model is working for us. So I'm not saying this is the right way of thinking about it, but it is our way of thinking about it. And it's this 4+1 model. So the basic notion is that we have 4 quadrants which effectively form the core of data science. And the +1 are all the verticals, the disciplines where we actually apply it. And so those 4, the obvious one is analytics, which is what most people think about. But we like to think that the other 3 are equally important. And just going around those a little, so I'll dig in slightly more in a second. But let's start with systems. So systems is really around the means to communicate and convey benefit through our hardware, software systems, also relating to cyber security and things like that. Analytics, we've said, that's pretty obvious. Design is really the human-computer interface, how we communicate. Justice and policy and law and other things that relate to what we call as a package responsible data science. So it's the notion of there's a tension between what one can do with data science that's very positive against what there might be that could potentially be construed as negative. And we know that that tension is really in full swing right now. Cambridge Analytica, of course, is an example of how that's been interpreted. And here we go again. So you can put these things together and you can look at their interplay. So if you look, for example, value plus analytics is really about human-centered AI, algorithmic bias, and many other things. I won't go through this list, but this is sort of the interplay of how we think about these things. So I would say, let's get rid of this. Thinking of data as a science unto itself is, I know it sounds bizarre, but it's in some ways novel and controversial, but it's certainly how we think about things. Uh-oh, now I'm making a complete mess of things. Hang on a sec. The data scientists that work here, it's really embarrassing. All right. So let's just dig into a couple of the quadrants. The one that I spent quite a lot of time thinking about when I was at the NIH is the notion of systems. Obviously, there's been a progression that you folks know probably better than I around databases, data warehouses from a sort of organizational perspective. One of the things that we've put forward when I was at NIH was the notion of Data Commons, which is essentially organizing data around the whole discipline. So when I was at NIH, I said to Francis Collins my first week, "What is my job?" He said, "Your job is to change the culture of NIH. It's to take the 27 institutes and centers, the $40 billion a year budget, and make it all work together where data is a catalyst." I said, "What do I do next week?" So if you think about what goes on in an academic institution, when we were setting up the school, it was exactly the same thing. We had a meeting with all the deans and the president of the university, and there was all this argument about whether we should have the School of Data Science at all. And the dean of medicine leaned over to me and he said, "This must be really hard for you." I said, "This is a walk in the park compared to what I was doing at NIH. It's only a $3 or $4 billion a year budget, and it's only 11 schools, anyway." But we made some progress there, and the notion of this commons and those ideas, and I don't claim for 1 second that is a perfect model, but it's at least something that's beginning to take us forward. And then beyond that, of course, there's the complete ecosystems, how we think about putting things together. And in all of this, we've written various articles that relate to all of this. I won't bore you with one article. We wrote an article when I was at NIH that said, "Why isn't biomedicine more like Airbnb?" Because in many ways, if you think about it, I'm not saying it's a good analogy, but there are things to be taken from it. So, for example, Airbnb essentially is a pretty simple platform where you're actually playing hosts against guests against each other, and you're actually measuring value for each of those, and you're creating an environment for them to interact. Well, in many ways, that's what we're doing in science, right? We're creating platforms to allow people to interact and gain value. So there's something to be said, at least we think so, in this kind of analogy. But anyway, let's just give you an example of how we think about systems. Whoops. I'm going forward and not backwards. Oh, that works better. Okay. I think it's this laptop that's broken. It's not me. I mentioned about value, but just to give you a specific example that's outside of, is the sort of notion of, you know, patient. And I really like this quote, and I wasn't familiar with it until I started working in this. But this is Article 27 of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 27 guarantees the rights of every individual in the world to share in scientific advancement and its benefits, including to freely engage in responsible scientific inquiry. So that's one side of the equation. The other side, of course, is the privacy of, for example, with respect to patient data. So there's a balance here. This is this tension that exists. I'll give you an example at the end of, I think, the power of the electronic health record. But there's obviously considerations that are fairly significant. Let's just speak about the importance of integration. And this is just an example I really like to illustrate this. So I'm sitting in my office one day and there's a knock on the door, and it's just this fellow, Thomas Hartke. He comes in, he says, I'm a trauma surgeon and I work in the ER. I said, oh, what do you want? And he says, I want to learn about data science. I said, why do you want to learn about data science? He said, well, I've been doing trauma surgeries for a long time now. When patients come in, frequently it's from a car accident. And what I noticed is that, well, things happen. So they die in the scanner. On the other hand, you know, if they recover and I'm talking to them and I learn the kind of accident they had, I started making these mental correlations between the kind of accident they had and the kind of internal injuries they had. He said, I got interested enough in this. I went and I actually learned some Python and I started playing with R in my spare time. I said, you have spare time? He said, not much. And he said, but I got stuck, I need help. And I said, well, what have you? He said, I went and I went to the Department of Motor Vehicles and I downloaded all the crash records for Virginia. I said, just working with a DMV, you deserve a medal already. And then he said, I've got access to the EHR. Anyway, he started a master's in data science and now has found the correlation, you know, these correlations in a quantitative way, with the intent of the idea being that the emergency responders will send a picture of the crash to the ER. So when the patient arrives, they know what kind of crash it is, and they then look for use those correlates to actually look at internal injuries for particular types of internal injuries first, with the hope of actually narrowing the amount of time to treatment that would actually help the patient. So to me, this is like the epitome of what data science can do. It's basically the notion that who would have thought about bringing, you know, this really transport data and electronic health data together to actually come up with things that are going to have a positive effect on society. That seems to me what it is we should be doing here. And we train our students to do this. This is just a shameless plug about the success of our students. I won't go into it, but you know, obviously the demand for this, as you're well experiencing, is huge, and the number of students wanting to do this kind of work is just increasing. Whoops, I'm going ahead here. We're not alone. You're not alone in all of this. There's an organization called the Academic Data Science Alliance that actually was funded by the Moore and Sloan Foundations, which is looking at a lot of these things. And has basically been monitoring what's happening in institutions across the country. This is now, 5 years old. There's now probably at least 300 different data science efforts across the country. The majority are working on master's programs, but now our PhD program was just approved last week. We have a undergraduate minor. We're starting an undergraduate, will be a 3-year degree. The first year will be in the college. Others are doing very similar things. So there's just enormous growth in this, enormous potential. The question then becomes, well, what is it? How do you divide up this? And we've actually focused on a series of areas that relate to us. I won't go into them, but they're obviously, some of them are pretty obvious. They're ones where we feel we can have the maximum benefit on society. And this is just a breakdown of our current research portfolio. We're still small, but research is a very distinct part of what we're doing, and it's growing fast. So with so much opportunity, what to do? When we were thinking about this, so once we actually narrowed down what our model of data science was, the next question is, well, how do we leverage that? How do we use it effectively? And we really looked at it in the context of what our institution was good at. We're a good engineering school. We're not a great engineering school. We're good at a number of other things, but not necessarily great at them. What we are really recognized for is public policy and law. And so and leadership. So one of the aspects of what we're now trying to do is to actually really extend the notion of what we do in data science, and let's say STEM more generally, such that in this notion of translation and responsible data science, that we actually turn that into leadership and policy and law that's going to make a difference in society. Easily said, of course, and hard to do. I'd also say, and I can't speak for what you do here, but within our own engineering school, I would say that, and we're struggling with this, it's going to be a big struggle to actually mesh this value quadrant with everything else, because we have, in our place, it's called a Department of Engineering and Society. And that's the department that's concerned with the, let's just call it the ethical consequences of what we might do in various types of engineering. It's frankly sort of out there on a limb. It's not fully integrated into the rest of the organization. And we're desperately trying to create a school of data science where the responsibilities that are really ingrained into all we do. And it's a real battle, to be honest. So, it's a work in progress. The reasons, of course, for responsible data science are all the kinds of things that you read about. If you haven't read the AI book by Schmidt and Kissinger, and I've forgotten the third author now at MIT, but that's got some real wake-up calls about the need to be responsible in this space, particularly the part that was clearly written by Henry Kissinger. The basic notion of what can happen with data science and with AI, machine learning. I mean, when you've got, and of course, this is kind of apropos currently, but when you've got nuclear proliferation, that is very well measured, and it's also very controlled, and it's very hard to do. On the other hand, in the world of AI and machine learning, you can have someone sitting in their bedroom with a laptop that can actually create all manner of havoc in the world. So that notion of responsibility is really important. Can this happen? Yes. And I'll give you an example. It goes back to my son on Industrial Light and Magic. It turns out the whole company, it's a Disney company now, for all of their efforts and all of the work they did, they ended up hiring a kid, young in his early 20s, I don't think he even had a degree, that had actually developed some algorithms for actually doing all sorts of rendering that's done by companies like Industrial Light and Magic, things that they hadn't even been able to do in their own organization, in their own large organization. So it's kind of the flip side of what I was saying earlier about DeepMind. So it happens in both directions. So what are the challenges? I'd say for us and for you probably going forward, it's really, with all this opportunity, it's really about deciding what not to do. And that's a tough thing because, there's so much opportunity. I think the competition for the best people to do this work, as I'm sure you're finding out, is pretty intense. And, the supply and demand right now is completely out of whack. The faculty are coming in with quite outrageous expectations. I think it's important to have a diverse team, and there's lots of data that shows all of this. and it's something that we're trying to take very seriously. And it's something that, as an old white male, I have to say that we haven't done. It's only in the last few years that I really started to think about this deeply. I just hired an associate dean for diversity and equity inclusion who's really opened my eyes to some of the situations that exist. Engineering, of course, has been subject to this over many years as well. We are making amends, and I'm very grateful for that. This was brought home to me about 2 years ago when Jennifer Doudna was one of the recipients in chemistry, the Nobel Prize for their work on her work on gene editing. And it prompted me, knowing her, and I sent her a congratulatory note and so forth. And it prompted me to go back and look at my 1975, I think it was, Department of Chemistry photograph of us all standing on the steps. And there was, I think, about 80 people. There was 3 women. 2 of those were administrative assistants, and with 1 graduate student in the whole department. So things have obviously changed for a lot of the better, but we've still got a long way to go. I think there's lack of, in our case, we have a lack of a comprehensive enterprise-wide data infrastructure that goes, crosses all these boundaries between desktops to clusters, to national labs, to public and private clouds, and so on. We don't have a good, we haven't got a good setup for that yet. And above all else, I'd say, when you're trying to move in a different direction in an academic institution, it's hard. It's actually easier to conform in many cases. Example, you want to make a dual hire, but we're very committed to the idea, if you're going to be interdisciplinary, you've got to have people have appointments in multiple places. Setting up those things, if you have a faculty member has a dual appointment, it's not twice as amount of work. For us, I don't speak for us, it's 3 times or more times the amount of work to actually make that happen. And so, and yet everybody speaks to the notion that we need more interdisciplinary research. So there you go. No one's pushing back here. Right? So maybe that'll come. I'll get beaten up when I step away. So just this is the growth of our school. When I came, there's 5 people. We're about 75 now. And as I said, our PhD program's approved. We're building a new building. Lots of things going on. I won't go into that, but I'm happy to talk about that ad infinitum. So let me finish with just something that who's familiar with the 4th paradigm, just out of interest? Okay, good. So Jim Gray, who's familiar with Jim Gray? Okay, so Jim Gray was a Turing Prize winner for a lot of work that he did with around databases and things of that nature. He actually disappeared at sea, which is a real tragedy. He was at Microsoft near the end of his career, and he coined this notion that there were effectively being 4 paradigms over time as it relates to research. The first was empirical, just general observation. The second was like model-based theoretical science, laws of Newton's laws and so on. The third was the computational paradigm. And the 4th, as we are today, was the data paradigm. What's interesting about these paradigms, if you buy into it, is the amount of time that each one existed before the next one took over actually decreased dramatically. So that's sort of where we are right now. I was giving this piece of this talk anyway, somewhere else. And of course, someone said to me, well, what's the 5th paradigm? I had absolutely no idea. I still don't have any idea, except I took a guess. And the guess for me is that it's really more about taking all that we've done so far and putting it all together, particularly as it relates to integration across scales. And when I put that in a biological context, I would say that it's really what happens in different scales of biology, everything from molecules to cohorts of patients to populations, and then all of the tools and the methods that go with that, putting it all together into one system, which I'd say today, the limitations, there are some technical limitations, but much more of the limitation relates to the culture of how people have been trained and how they've been brought up and what they do relative to, they were used to working on one gene. They're not used to working in a systems-wide context of looking at that gene within the context of everything from a cell to a population. And, oh gosh, an example of that is work, just give you one example very quickly from our own recent work, is there was sort of anecdotal evidence that statins, which of course have positive effects on cancer. So that's obviously statins prescribed for something else, but it was noted that different statins, if you drew a matrix, that different statins would have different potentially positive effects on different cancers. So this was a sort of anecdotal observations. We actually then went into electronic health records to actually pull out a lot of data on different types of cancer patients and who happened to also be on statins. This was a study, you need large numbers. So this was a study that was done over Europe and the US. And indeed, we then came up with some what looked like some correlations. We tested those in animal models, and then you make predictions at the molecular level through biochemical pathways of what might be going on. So it's a multi-scale modeling that goes from molecules all the way to cohorts of patients to try and bring all that together in one understanding. So that, to me, is my interpretation of what the fifth paradigm might be. So I leave you with this. Have I overstated the case for data science? Looking at you, I'd say you probably think so. Are we currently doing the best by our students in the way we're teaching them? I'm sure there are other questions. Are the models we propose the right ones for what we're doing, at least going forward? And what should we be doing differently? And there's probably a lot. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you for your attention. And if there's any questions, any things to be thrown, please go right ahead.
So it seems like you talked a lot about two different aspects of data. One is what some people will call data engineering. I think you call it systems, wrangling all the data. Then there's the data analytics. How do you integrate those? Are they the same people? Are the same people learning both those things? Are they in different camps? Or how does that work in your school?
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting question. It's something we debate quite a lot, because I would characterize it as data engineering versus data science, which is probably, and clearly both are very important, and both to some degree lead to different paths of certainly of learning and ultimate outcomes. Right now, we actually, this is another important aspect, we have an advisory board of people who are actually hiring our students. So they're really important to us. We have the CIO of Capital One, for example. We have a fellow called Scott Stephenson, who's just stepped down as the president and CIO of Verisk Analytics, which is a Fortune 500 company. So these are hiring a lot of our graduates. And so we listen very closely to, the feedback loop needs to be made better, but that's what we're trying to do. And frankly, what they're telling us right now is we need data engineers much more than we need data scientists. And I can imagine that, I suppose. But yeah, we haven't by no means solved how we're going to deal with this. But or at least we're talking and thinking about it.
Yeah. Which
push back.
Oh yeah, I'll push a little back. But like, which multidisciplinary fields are more resilient to the integrations you described? And what are you trying to do to help that, if it even makes sense?
Yeah, well, let me just say that maybe I'm not answering your question directly, but there are clearly cultural differences across domains, verticals, right? So biomedicine, which I'm most familiar with, has clearly, because of the things like the Genome project, has been at this for a long time. So I think from that point of view, they have some, it's become somewhat ingrained in the culture. Other fields, it's just not there. Even in biomedicine, it's very variable. For example, in the clinical space. So just the sharing of the data in the first place. The editor of the New England Journal of Medicine wrote an editorial that said people like me and Dennis were actually data parasites. So now was mentioned about a meeting in Hawaii. Well, there's a meeting called the Pacific Symposium in Hawaii that happens every year, which I try and go to. And they actually have a data parasites award. So they actually award people who are the best data parasites. So, you know, that's not really getting asked you credit, but it's variable across fields. And, you know, when data science is wonderful in this regard, because we have anthropologists, we have all sorts of different types of people, and how the culture of their disciplines and how they treat academia is very different. And so, you know, I think there's a lot of work that's going to be done to that actually even get these people to share to start with, let alone integrate. And the value of integration doesn't necessarily come straight away. But my argument would be that the time to realize that it's important is shrinking. And I think these fields, what took 20 years with the human genome to create all this essentially, you know, say wealth, but all this industry, I think in other areas is going to be so much quicker. You know, so we just see it. I mean, just think about something completely different. Like, and it's not really about integration, but I just love this. So it's about history, right? So there was a site around for a while, which was sort of, where in the world is Francis Bacon? So what would have normally happened is historians would actually spend forever pouring through, you know, texts and doing all this kind of analysis, you know, this brute force analysis. Now they just do natural language processing on a lot of this digitized text. They can build, maybe they're rough relative to what an individual, but they're a starting point. So you can see where Francis Bacon was at a certain point, who he was interacting with, you know, so, and you can get that in an afternoon on a network, and then you can start analyzing that network. Surely that's so different than what happened, you know, going to the library and spending inordinate amounts of time pouring through text. It's not that some of that's not important, but the tools and the models and things we have and how you integrate other data with that is, you know, it's really profound, I think, for the future. Hey, I knew you were going
to. So up front, I never thought there's anything positive about COVID until then it stood up there, said he had to cancel your visit last fall. So I can live here listening to you.
Oh, that's very nice of you. I thought.
I see you want pushback. I'm going to put my weight behind that. So what do you see as the overlap between data science and the computer science? So, whether you have a way to draw a clear line to separate the two. By the way, congratulations for stealing my colleague at University of Rochester to chair the CS department at the Virginia University of Chicago. Tried and failed to unlock hers. Congratulations. But I'm thinking algorithms, programming as a way to explain to people what you want the computer to do. Just seems to me these are both fundamental in both fields.
Yeah, I should say that I have no formal training in computer science at all. As Dennis pointed out, my background is in physical chemistry. I drifted into biology and then I'd say computational science. But I mean, I work closely with the former chair of CS, Kevin Skadron. And, you know, just in general terms, I would say that I would characterize computer science, and this, you can push back on this, but really more fundamental and less related to application. That's how I would think about the difference. And related to application, of course, is the amount of data, or whether you look at data at all, right? So I'd say it's, to us at least, and to me, like, this is one of my biases because I started as essentially an experimentalist. I don't think in deeply theoretical terms. I think in terms of applications. And that's for me where I see the difference. But there's clearly, you know, it really depends very much on the institution that's doing this. I mean, a lot of the data science initiatives, of course, are coming out of certainly engineering schools and sometimes out of computer science, you know, departments or schools themselves, or information science, you know. So it really, lots of different flavors here. None of them are wrong. But I mean, I think it's important for us, with respect to the students who might come to to our institutions, that we make it very clear the flavor that we're actually working with. And we try and do that as best we can.
Okay, we got time for one last question. Laura.
So I'm curious about your thoughts of the interplay of the quadrant in your model related to education. So, is that interplay on tracking the whole curriculum and each quadrant has its own portion? Or does that even come in at sort of the first level where you start to see the value and the systems coming together within a course as well and excluding the students?
Yeah, that's a good question. I probably should have been clearer, but if you notice when I showed those 4 quadrants, they actually had different colors. And we actually take every program, every course, and we actually color code it in accordance with the level of each of those 4 quadrants within that course. And we actually try and, part of the notion that we have is we need in almost any course, even a course on deep learning, clearly the value aspect of that needs to be brought into that course. I think if the moment you actually say, okay, you do deep learning over here, then you go off and do an ethics course over here, and maybe it's an elective or something else, that's not what we're about. And so it is really trying to fuse these things together. And, there are elements of, I'd say, obviously to varying degrees in every course. When I send you the material, I promised this morning, you should see some of that.
Thank you.
Excellent. Join me again. Thank you for that.
Thank you for listening.